Hello and welcome to our story, 250 Years of the United States of America. The daily history show going year by year through all 250 years of American history. Let's get into the episode. It's here that normally I would briefly touch on where we left off and introduce the main topics we'll cover throughout the episode, but I feel we should pause for a moment and recap the overall state of America. Having signed the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War last year and finally having rid itself of the British military, America is in its most peaceful state for decades. The states that have ratified the Articles of Confederation are represented in Congress. They are the states that once comprised the 13 colonies: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. These are the only official states. Vermont, though functioning as an independent republic, has not been admitted to the Union and lacks representation in Congress. 12 of the 13 states have governors, though in Pennsylvania and Delaware, the state governor is referred to as the state president. All have a judicial system and a legislative body. The federal government under the Articles of Confederation is weak, with limited powers and significant challenges being the sole federal body with no executive or judicial branches. Congress can conduct foreign affairs, coin money, regulate Indian affairs, and settle interstate disputes, but cannot tax directly, regulate commerce, or practically enforce laws. It relies on state contributions, which are often withheld, leading to a depleted treasury. Less than $1.5 million was received from the states over the past 3 years, despite requests for $2 million last year alone. In total, the United States government is $43 million in debt. That sounds like a lot to me, but for some context, the current United States national debt is over 837,000 times that amount. Paper money issued by Congress has massively devalued, causing inflation. As we have mentioned previously, the use of hard specie, particularly the Spanish dollar, is increasingly replacing devalued continental bills, but the adoption remains slow. Rural areas especially have little use for this currency and are still almost universally bartering goods and services, while coastal cities and towns more easily begin, albeit still slowly, to adopt the new currency for use in international trade. Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation states that each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. And each state has one vote in Congress regardless of population. Delegates are appointed by state legislatures, not elected by the people. Outside of the 13 states, America now officially encompasses the Western Territories, which are not organized into states. The territories are under nominal federal oversight, but no single individual or body is actually leading, and the Confederation Congress appoints committees to address territorial issues as needed. The primary inhabitants of this region are the Indian nations, and settlers in these territories must seek permission from Congress to claim land officially, though many are unofficially living west of the formally recognized states. The western border of the United States is drawn at the Mississippi River. Slavery remains legal and widespread in most states, with no federal prohibition under the Articles of Confederation, and Congress possessing no power to regulate the states in this regard. Pennsylvania and Massachusetts are currently the most progressive states in terms of their treatment of slaves, with Pennsylvania considering children born to enslaved mothers servants instead of slaves who must be set free at the age of 28. Additionally, every slave has to be registered with the state, and any black people in the state that are not registered are considered free. The Quakers are a major reason for these laws, as their beliefs clash with the idea of human ownership, considering it a violation of natural law. Last year, for instance, Quaker abolitionist David Cooper published a pamphlet called A Serious Address to the Rulers of America, condemning slavery and urging American leaders to align their actions with the principles of liberty and equality espoused during the Revolution. In his writings, he appeals to logic over religion, criticizing the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom while perpetuating slavery. They are, of course, not alone in this belief. Many founding fathers agree the concept of slave ownership clashes with the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence, though they also strongly believe in a state's right to determine its own law. In Massachusetts, emancipation came not from legislative action, but from a judicial ruling, as the Commonwealth v. Jennison case from last year interpreted the concept of slavery as incompatible with the state constitution. Judge Cushing saying, "As to the doctrine of slavery and the right of Christians to hold Africans in perpetual servitude, it is a point which has undergone a full discussion, and upon the principles of the new Constitution, it is abolished." The Constitution there referenced was drafted by John Adams, and Article 1 states, "All men are born free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness." While Massachusetts courts will no longer uphold the right of any slave owner to hold slaves, the practice still exists either surreptitiously or by financial necessity, though in very, very small numbers. On the front of foreign relations, Britain has restricted U.S. trade, barring American merchants from the British West Indies, and is flooding the United States markets with their goods, lowering demand for goods from American craftsmen. And again, Congress lacks the authority to regulate trade or retaliate. Spain, controlling New Orleans and Florida, closes the Mississippi River to American navigation, further hindering Western trade. Georgia is attempting to occupy disputed territories in Spanish Florida, and again, Congress cannot order the state to stop. The United States is struggling to repay loans made by France, and much of their support has now ended. It's against this backdrop that we find ourselves in another new year. And for these United States, this is the first to begin in a state of peace. Welcome to 1784 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and Thomas Jefferson writes to James Madison. His letter begins with musings of geothermal activities, but he soon goes on to mention the issues that they've been having getting a quorum in Congress. He says, "We have never yet had more than 7 states, and very seldom that, as Maryland is scarcely ever present, and we are now without a hope of its attending till February. Consequently, having 6 states only, we do nothing. Expresses and letters are gone forth to hasten on the absent states, that we may have 9 for a ratification of the definitive treaty. Jersey perhaps may come in, and if Beersford will not come to Congress, Congress must go to him to do this one act. Even now it is full late. The critical situation in which we are like to be gave birth to an idea that 7 might ratify, but it could not be supported. I will give you a further account of this when it shall be finally settled." Just 2 weeks later, the Confederation Congress ratifies the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain, signed on September 3rd of last year, but at this very moment, relations remain strained. Britain has yet to yield their northwestern forts that should have reverted to American hands according to the terms of the treaty. Looking into this, I found it pretty challenging to nail down details on the number of forts held in total, but there is a spattering in upstate New York and near Lake Champlain. It seems the British were looking to enforce the terms of the treaty via this unauthorized presence, citing debts still owed to the Crown and to British merchants. Several state courts claim the declaration of war and subsequent treaty wiped the slate on their owed interest, but Britain disagrees, and the Confederation Congress hands remain tied on interfering with the state's decisions. In reality, it's more likely this stated issue of pre-war debts is a diversion from the real reason Britain wants to hold the forts: controlling and securing the fur trade. It is at this time the single most profitable industry in North America, and these northwestern forts just so happen to closely mirror the routes often taken by fur traders. Aside from the profit motive, the British speculate that the United States lacks the resources to effectively secure the route, as it's largely outside of their 13 states. Another factor is relations with Indians. Last year's treaty does not address the Indians at all, a fact that doesn't go unnoticed by many tribes. The proclamation line is dissolved. Britain largely considers the agreements made with Indians to be effectual, but has traded their land out from under them in seeking an end to the war. Britain is sort of in between a rock and a hard place as they look to maintain allyship with the Indians in the United States and, more importantly, Canada, but are looking to avoid actions the United States views as an encroachment of their sovereignty. With a lack of clear instruction and a vacuum of any meaningful enforcement mechanism for what rules do exist, the northwestern lands remain in a rocky status quo for now. In February, the Massachusetts Bank is established as the first state-chartered joint stock bank in the U.S. Early account holders include Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, Henry Knox, and John Hancock, who signed the bank's charter. On March 1st, Virginia formally cedes its claims to lands north of the Ohio River to the Congress of the Confederation, honoring the previous agreement from '81 that convinced Maryland to ratify the Articles. This act transfers control of roughly 200,000 square miles of land to Congress, which will begin laying the groundwork for how new states may be created, and shifts some power dynamics as federal authority over territories grows, despite the Article's limitations of their authority over states. Congress begins crafting an ordinance for the government of the Northwest Territory, with Thomas Jefferson being tasked with creating this draft. On March 2nd, Governor George Clinton of New York writes to Congress, asking them to declare Vermont, which is, at this time, an unrecognized de facto independent state residing on land claimed by New York, to be in a state of rebellion and to authorize the use of force to take it back. Clinton and other New York leaders fear that allowing Vermont to remain independent will encourage other frontier regions to break away from established states and thus loosen the ties that hold the 13 states together. Vermont has operated independently for 7 years now and has repeatedly applied for admission to the Union, though no resolution has been reached. While there are some delegates who sympathize with New York's legal claim, particularly from states concerned about similar breakaway movements, there is also significant sympathy for Vermont's position among others. No state moves to grant Clinton the ability to go to war with Vermont, Congress generally having no desire for an internal conflict. In April, the Congress of the Confederation adopts the Land Ordinance authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson. The ordinance embraces the principle that the western lands should be transformed into states and incorporated into the Union on an equal basis with the original 13. Jefferson's proposal stipulates that the land should be divided into 14 rectangular commonwealths, each proceeding through consecutive stages of self-government, culminating with statehood as its population grows. The ordinance declares that the region will forever be subject to the federal government and requires its developed areas to assume a proportional part of the national debt incurred during the Revolutionary War. It promises support for public education and guarantees residents the same civil rights available in the original states. Jefferson's draft includes provisions forbidding citizenship to any person with a hereditary title of nobility and prohibiting slavery in the territory after 1800, which would have applied not only to the Northwest Territory, but also all future federally controlled land. This last article fails in Congress by a single vote, while the remainder of the ordinance is approved on April 23rd. Though it gets hung up as Congress lacks the mechanisms needed to implement it. It's becoming increasingly clear that the limits placed on Congress are bogging down this fledgling nation and preventing the type of changes needed to accelerate its expansion and growth. A big change is happening in New Hampshire. As we covered in our first episode, New Hampshire was the first state to create a constitution and, in doing so, formally declared its independence from British rule. A new constitution was approved near the end of last year, and now, on June 2nd, it's going into effect. The first part of this new state constitution is a Bill of Rights, a formal statement of natural rights that the government may make no law to abridge, and these rights are as follows. All men are born equally free and independent. Therefore, all government of right originates from the people, is founded in consent, and instituted for the general good. All men have certain natural, essential, and inherent rights, among which are the enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and, in a word, of seeking and obtaining happiness. When men enter into a state of society, they surrender up some of their natural rights to that society in order to ensure the protection of others, and, without such an equivalent, the surrender is void. Among the natural rights, some are in their very nature unalienable, because no equivalent can be given or received for them. Of this kind are the rights of conscience. Every individual has a natural and unalienable right to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience and reason, and no subject shall be hurt, molested, or restrained in his person, liberty, or estate for worshiping God in the manner and season most agreeable to the dictates of his own conscience, or for his religious profession, sentiments, or persuasion, provided he doth not disturb the public peace or disturb others in their religious worship. Much of this document, despite its being over 2 centuries old, is plainly interpreted upon its first reading, but it's worth noting a few key points. Although the wording in the first article may seem to indicate otherwise, slavery remains a part of life in New Hampshire, though to a much lesser extent than other states. There is an unfortunate but well-proven reason as to why, despite such language as all men are born equally free and independent, slavery is allowed to persist. Slaves are genuinely considered in the eyes of many not to be men, but property, more like livestock than employees. Repeatedly reinforced in this Bill of Rights is the implication of a social contract necessary for the American way of life, but the third article says it outright, stating that when people agree to live under a government, they give up certain natural rights, but only do so in exchange for protection of their remaining rights. This is a common belief amongst Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Rousseau, and its stipulation that if protection is not provided, the deal is null and void and citizens have no obligation to obey, is one that was exemplified in the war that ended just last year. By inserting such a line into their own state's constitution, the New Hampshire government is providing a constitutional basis for civil disobedience and possibly even revolution should the government lapse in its required role of defense of its people. A final point worth noting is the wording of the fifth article. It protects the rights of citizens to worship God, capital G, in their own way. This theistic definition of religious liberty is specifically included to prevent the punishment of non-Protestant religions like Catholicism and Judaism, but also protects worship only if it doesn't disturb others in their religious worship, which is relevant as things like public blasphemy are still not tolerated. The article also reinforces the idea of a social contract by making it clear the extent of one's rights end where another's begin. There is, however, a big difference between something being written and it being practiced. Catholics and Jews face significant social prejudice even here. Up north, New York City is in a state of disrepair, but determined to bounce back. Plans for a Bank of New York have been prepared earlier in the year, the primary goal being to assist in the rebuilding of New York's economy and to support merchants and industry by providing short-term credit. Alexander Hamilton single-handedly writes its constitution, though does so anonymously as he is also a founder of the now rival Bank of North America, which opened in '82. In the constitution of this bank, the number of shares any one person can own is limited to prevent monopolization, and dividends are paid in hard coin as even many investors remain distrustful of paper currency. On June 9th, the Bank of New York opens for business without a state charter, essentially running as a private and self-regulating corporation. Less than 2 weeks after the implementation of the new constitution in New Hampshire, Meshach Weir is sworn in as the first president of the state on June 15th after the colony of New Hampshire had abolished the position in '76, replacing it with an executive council. The New Hampshire people have become so disenchanted with the idea of a self-serving royal governor that they no longer use the title, thus calling Weir president of the state. Continuing our trend of eulogizing the signers of the Declaration, Caesar Rodney passes away at the age of 55. He was born in Jones Neck, Delaware, on October 7th of 1728. He was a soldier, a judge, a delegate to the American Continental Congress, Speaker of the Delaware Assembly, a chief executive of Delaware, a justice of the state's Supreme Court, and held many other offices of public trust. Today, there is an equestrian statue in Wilmington, Delaware, of Rodney riding into Philadelphia to cast Delaware's deciding vote for the Declaration of Independence in July of '76. It stands as a symbol of Delaware's participation in the American Revolution and in the signing of the Declaration. He died from a form of facial cancer on the 26th of June, making him the 10th of the 56 signers to pass away, and he was buried at his birthplace in Jones Neck, Delaware. On July 4th, the United States celebrates its Independence Day for the 8th time. John Adams writes in his diary, "This is the anniversary of our glorious independence. Whilst the nations of Europe are enveloped in luxury and dissipation, and a universal venality prevails through Britain, may the new empire, gracious heaven, become the guardian and protector of religion and liberty, of universal benevolence and philanthropy. May those virtues which are banished from the land of our nativity find a safe asylum with the inhabitants of this new world." Just west of North Carolina and the Appalachian Mountains, some settlers live in uncertainty after the ceding of their lands to the federal government. They fear that their land is now vulnerable to being sold to foreign powers, or that they may not receive protection from the states should there be a need for their public defense. Delegates from Washington, Sullivan, Spencer, and Greene counties convene in Jonesboro, and on August 23rd they declare their independence from North Carolina. John Sevier is elected as this new state's governor, marking the beginning of an extra-legal government operating independently from North Carolina named Franklin, and many hope it will eventually become the nation's 14th state. On August 14th, Grigory Shelekhov, a Russian fur trader, founds the first permanent colony on Kodiak Island in Alaska. Russia has been exploring the Alaskan coast for decades and harvesting seal furs for their highly efficient insulating and water-repelling qualities. And now, the trade is beginning to boom, creating the need for permanent infrastructure to facilitate the harvesting and trading of these furs. I'll briefly mention that Lafayette stays with George Washington at his Mount Vernon estate in September, and while the visit is a personal one, The reunion is an indication of just how strong the bonds formed during the Revolutionary War were, with Lafayette calling George Washington a father figure. As there are very few portraits that depict events from this year, we have selected the painting of the reunion of Lafayette and George Washington at Mount Vernon as the cover for today's episode. Now, let's head back to New York, where members of the Six Nations, an Indian confederacy, are arriving at Fort Stanwix. The fort is currently unlivable as it was burned down and abandoned in 81, so temporary buildings are constructed including a council house and living quarters. Federal representatives are scheduled to meet the Six Nations Confederacy to negotiate a peace treaty with American Indian nations to end a brutal and asymmetrical war. But they're running late, so Governor of New York George Clinton steps in to negotiate a treaty as well as land transactions with the Indians, but he is rebuffed. All the federal representatives arrive by October 5th, including Richard Butler, Arthur Lee, and a regiment from the Continental Army. Angered by Clinton's advances towards the Six Nations, all the New York representatives are ordered to leave the fort. The Six Nations Confederacy says that they are authorized to negotiate a treaty for themselves, as well as, and stick with me here, the Ottawa, Chippewa, Huron, Potawatomi, Mississauga, Miami, Delaware, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek nations, which rubs the Americans the wrong way. The United States policy is to keep the Indian nations divided to avoid a native union from forming and complicating future expansion and relations. In the course of negotiations, the United States grants peace to the Six Nations, recognizes the allegiance of the Oneida and Tuscarora nations, while admonishing the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations for taking up arms against them. It's the United States' position that the Indians are largely a conquered people, and that by their siding with the British and the British ceding their land claims in the treaty last year, any land now granted to the natives will be given at the United States' discretion. This is reflected in a quote often attributed to Butler, but most likely a paraphrase, that says, "You joined the British king against us and followed his fortunes. We have overcome him. He has cast you off and given us your country. And Congress, in bounty and mercy, offer you country and peace. We have told you the terms on which you shall have it. These terms we will not alter." By the end of the negotiations, the Six Nations cede their claims to lands in western Pennsylvania and New York, as well as promising to return American prisoners and to a full cessation of hostilities. The United States assures mutual peace and gives the natives customary diplomatic gifts such as clothing, tools, and alcohol, promising that they may retain their remaining lands in New York and live under U.S. protection. While the land ceded is retroactively referred to as the last purchase, no money is given or promised to the Six Nations, and the contentious meeting comes to a disputed end. Even before Congress has approved the treaty, plans are being laid to survey and sell this newly acquired land, but the Six Nations deny that their delegates had the authority to cede lands, and tribes that live on the lands are outraged that they were not consulted. Instead of a treaty for peace, this United States claim to the huge swaths of land currently inhabited by numerous Indian nations sets the two groups on a collision course for an armed conflict as the year nears its end. Before we go, however, let's take a moment and talk about two examples of religious pluralism growing in these new United States. On November 26th, Pope Pius VI formally establishes the Roman Catholic Apostolic Prefecture of the United States, marking the first official recognition of the Catholic Church's structure in the country, allowing for the organization of Catholic worship and leadership independent of foreign control. And just a month later, on December 25th, the Methodist Episcopal Church is officially founded at the Christmas Conference in Baltimore, led by Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. This gathering formalizes the Methodist movement in America, which has grown rapidly during the Revolution. Though the founder of Methodism never came to America himself, his authorization of Koch to oversee the conference plays a direct role in the church's American formation. Meanwhile, the Anglican Church loses its official status in several states, including New York, where it is disestablished by law and stripped of control over King's College, a stronghold of Loyalist influence during the war. This shift from a church and crown-controlled institution to a publicly accountable one reflects this new country's Republican ideals of civic education and leadership based on merit rather than birthright. The school is soon renamed Columbia University for the alternative name of America, which is itself taken from Christopher Columbus. And this name change coincides with the deliberate rejection of royal authority. Well, that's it for 1784, our first year officially no longer at war with Britain. It's one of a number of transitional years as the United States is struggling to find its footing, operating under the weak Articles of Confederation. Join us tomorrow for 1785 as we discuss more treaties and land disputes, as well as the further formation and implementation of America's new currency, as well as an invention that changes the world. If you're enjoying the show, take just a moment to either follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and if possible, leave us a review and get in contact. Send a message on X or email 250yearsofusa@gmail.com to tell me what you're enjoying about the show, what we missed, or what we got wrong. This has been our story, 250 years of the United States of America. And as always, thanks for listening.